Have you ever wondered if the last $500 in your bank account could change not just your future, but rewrite history itself? I want to tell you about Catherine Morrison, a 52-year-old woman in the small town of Millbrook, Wyoming, and the railway car that saved her life in ways she never imagined possible. The eviction notice had been taped to Catherine Morrison's apartment door for 3 days before she found the courage to peel it off. December in Wyoming meant mornings so cold your breath turned to crystals before it left your lips. And as Kate stood in her threadbare robe reading those brutal words, she felt the chill seep through her bones in ways that had nothing to do with the weather. 30 days. That's all she had left. Inside her studio apartment, Kate made coffee with unsteady hands. The kind of tremor that comes when you're 52 years old and the life you thought you'd built has crumbled like old plaster. The divorce papers had been finalized 6 months ago. 25 years of marriage dissolved because David Morrison had decided that his secretary's youth was worth more than his wife's devotion. Kate stared at her bank balance on her phone screen. $547 after working double shifts at Riverside Diner for 8 months, after selling her grandmother's jewelry and most of the furniture David hadn't claimed. This was what remained of her life. The phone buzzed. Emma, her 24-year-old daughter, texting from Denver. "Busy day at work, Mom. Call you tonight?" Kate typed back. "Of course, honey, but didn't mention the eviction notice." Emma was finally building her own life, 1 year into her marketing job and dating someone who made her laugh. Kate couldn't bear to be the anchor that dragged her daughter back into the wreckage. At Riverside Diner, the morning rush provided blessed distraction. Kate poured coffee and served eggs over easy to ranchers and retirees. Her smile practiced and professional, even as her mind churned with impossible mathematics. First month's rent, last month's rent, security deposit. Even the cheapest places in Millbrook wanted $2,400 up front, and that was for apartments that smelled like cigarettes and defeat. It was during the afternoon lull that Eleanor Whitman shuffled through the diner's front door, snow dusting the shoulders of her ancient wool coat. At 89, Ellie was sharp as mountain air, a retired librarian who noticed everything and spoke carefully, as if words were precious things to be handled with care. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world, dear," Ellie said, settling into her usual corner booth. Her eyes, bright behind wire-rimmed glasses, studied Kate with the kind of attention that made secrets feel impossible to keep. Kate poured Ellie's coffee without being asked. "Just tired, I suppose." Tired and desperate are different creatures entirely. Ellie reached into her purse and pulled out a folded section of newspaper. "I've been carrying this around for a week, debating whether fate intended it for someone specific." She slid the classified section across the worn Formica table. A small ad circled in blue ink seemed to pulse with possibility. Historic railway car on private land near Millbrook. Needs restoration. $500 OBO. Winter caretaker arrangement possible. Call Dorothy. Kate's throat tightened. "I need a place to live, not a museum piece." Sometimes what we need and what we think we need are different things entirely. Ellie's voice carried the weight of 9 decades of observation. That railway car has been sitting on Dorothy Sullivan's property for 3 years, ever since her husband Harold passed. Dorothy's been looking for someone to care for it, someone who understands that some places choose their people. The afternoon sun slanted through the diner's windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like possibilities in the air. Kate found herself studying the advertisement, imagining what desperation looked like at $500. "Sometimes, dear," Ellie continued, "we need to stop running from our past and start building our sanctuary." That evening, Kate drove the winding road toward Dorothy Sullivan's property as snow began falling steadily. The landscape was austere and beautiful, rolling hills dressed in white, the kind of country that demanded resilience from everything that called it home. Dorothy Sullivan answered the door before Kate could knock, as if she'd been watching from the window. At 75, she moved with careful grace, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her green eyes held both sadness and an unexpected shrewdness. "You must be Catherine," Ellie called, "but I should tell you up front, this isn't just about the railway car. Harold left me specific instructions before he died, saying that someday a woman would come looking for shelter, and when she did, I was to give her Harold's discovery." They walked across snow-covered ground, their footsteps crunching in the pristine white. The railway car sat on a short stretch of track, its faded green paint and weathered wood testament to decades of Wyoming winters. But even in decay, there was something solid about it, something that spoke of journeys and stories and permanence. Harold bought it from an estate sale in 2019, Dorothy explained, producing a ring of keys from her coat pocket. The seller was anxious to get rid of it quickly, said it had been in storage since the 1940s. Harold always wondered why someone would abandon something so well preserved. Inside the railway car, Kate discovered that Harold's restoration had been strategic. He'd modernized the essentials, plumbing, electricity, heating, but left most of the original fixtures untouched. The space was larger than her studio apartment, with windows along both sides that framed the snowy landscape like paintings. And at the far end of the car, she noticed something that made her pulse quicken. A door that looked different from the others, older and more substantial, with brass fittings that gleamed despite the car's overall neglect. Harold spent his last 2 years obsessing over that door, Dorothy said quietly. It's locked, and none of the keys work. But 3 days before he died, he figured out how to open it. What he found inside, well, he said it would change everything for whoever came after him. Dorothy pulled a brass key from her pocket, different from the others. He made me promise to give this only to someone who truly needed sanctuary. Someone desperate enough to appreciate what they'd found. Standing in that railway car as snow tapped against the windows like Morse code, Kate felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The possibility of peace. Not luxury, not security in any traditional sense, but the kind of quiet that might allow a broken person to remember who they'd been before everything fell apart. I'll take it, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. Dorothy nodded as if she'd expected nothing less. Harold would have liked you. He always believed that desperate people make the best caretakers because they understand the value of sanctuary. Before we continue with Kate's journey into the unknown, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever felt that the universe was guiding you towards something unexpected, maybe even frightening? Sometimes our biggest breakthroughs come disguised as our biggest risks. Share your stories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring tales of second chances and hidden discoveries. Kate moved into the railway car on January 1st, because if you're going to start over, you might as well do it when the whole world is pretending to believe in new beginnings. The first weeks were a dance between despair and discovery. The wood stove filled the space with heat that seemed to seep into her bones, but every sound was amplified. Wind whistling around the corners, snow sliding off the roof, the settling creaks of old timber. Kate lay on the narrow bed she'd fashioned from one of the bench seats, wrapped in quilts Dorothy had provided, and slowly learned the rhythms of solitude. But mornings brought unexpected grace. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the space with golden warmth that made everything seem possible again. Kate made coffee on the small stove and stood at the eastern windows, watching the sun paint the snow-covered hills in shades of rose and amber. In those quiet moments, she felt something she'd almost forgotten, the possibility of peace. Tom Bradley appeared during her second week, arriving with tools and the kind of quiet competence that solved problems without making her feel helpless. At 67, he was a Vietnam veteran with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too much but somehow retained kindness. His wife had died 5 years earlier, and he understood the particular loneliness of rebuilding a life after everything familiar had been stripped away. Railroad cars are temperamental, he explained, adjusting the wood stove's damper. They were built for people who understood that comfort was something you created, not something you bought. Martha Rodriguez arrived the following week with a casserole and the kind of determined friendship that didn't wait for invitations. At 58, Martha was the head librarian, a position she'd held for 15 years, and possessed a gift for seeing past surfaces to the stories underneath. Dorothy mentioned you might be interested in local history, Martha said, settling into Kate's small living space as if they'd been friends for years. This railway car has quite a story, if you're curious about what Harold discovered. The locked door at the end of the car became Kate's obsession during the long winter evenings. She'd studied it from every angle, tried every key Dorothy had given her, even attempted to pick the lock with hairpins like some middle-aged amateur detective. but it remained stubbornly sealed, keeping its secrets. It was during Emma's first visit in February that Kate finally used Dorothy's brass key. Emma had driven up from Denver for the weekend, bringing her boyfriend Marcus, and Kate wanted to show them the mystery that had been consuming her thoughts. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" Emma asked as Kate fitted the brass key into a nearly invisible keyhole she'd finally discovered behind a loose brass plate. "No," Kate admitted, "but I'm sure I can't keep wondering about it forever." The door opened to reveal not a storage compartment, but a perfectly preserved workspace from the 1940s. A desk dominated the small space, its surface covered with papers, a fountain pen, and photographs that made Kate's breath catch. The walls were lined with maps, railway schedules, and images of families, faces looking directly at the camera with expressions of hope and determination. The leather journal on the desk bore a name written in precise script. James Whitaker, Personal Record, 1942-1945. "My God," Martha whispered, picking up one of the photographs. "This is documentation of an underground network. Look at these dates. This was happening during World War II." Kate opened the journal carefully. James's story unfolded in meticulous detail. A railway conductor who had used his position to help Jewish refugees and other persecuted families escape to safety throughout the Mountain West. But James wasn't working alone. The journal revealed James's partnership with William Ashford, heir to a mining fortune who had grown disgusted with his family's support for isolationist policies that abandoned Jewish refugees. William had used his wealth and connections to fund an extensive network, eventually staging his own disappearance in 1943 to work full-time in the underground movement. William's death was reported as a climbing accident in the Tetons, James had written. But the truth is that William Ashford gave up everything, his inheritance, his family name, his comfortable life, because he understood that some things matter more than safety. He is alive, operating under the name William Forrest in Calgary, and his sacrifice has saved over 200 families. Emma studied the photographs with the sharp eye of her generation. "Mom, these aren't just historical documents. Look at the condition of everything, the way it's organized. Someone meant for this to be found." As winter melted into spring, Kate became consumed by the implications of her discovery. The Ashford family was still prominent in Wyoming. Robert Ashford III was a powerful businessman whose family foundation funded cultural institutions throughout the state, always emphasizing their patriotic family history. But Martha's research revealed a darker truth. The official family history made no mention of William's activities or his staged disappearance. Instead, it painted William as a tragic figure whose reckless mountaineering had led to his death. A version that protected the family's reputation while bearing the truth about their ancestors' heroism. "Kate," Martha said during one of their research sessions, "if this story comes out, it could completely upend the Ashford family's position in this state. Robert Ashford III just announced his intention to run for governor. They won't let this go quietly." Kate thought about James, writing by lamplight in his hidden workspace, recording truths he knew might cost him everything. She thought about William, giving up wealth and comfort to fight for justice. And she thought about herself, living in the space where these men had planned their acts of courage. "Someone needs to tell their story," Kate said finally. "James preserved all of this for a reason." At the bottom of James's filing cabinet, Kate found something that elevated everything from historical curiosity to explosive revelation, a sealed envelope marked "Evidence for law enforcement when safe." Inside were photographs and documents that proved the Ashford family's mining operations had used forced labor from refugee camps, and that they'd been paid by the government to house political prisoners who then disappeared. But more importantly, the envelope contained a modern edition, a letter dated 2019 in Harold Sullivan's handwriting. "To whoever finds this, I am Harold Sullivan, and I purchased this railway car specifically because I suspected what it contained. My grandfather was Deputy Sheriff Frank Sullivan. In 1945, he was ordered to destroy all records of the Ashford family's wartime activities. Instead, he hid copies and passed them to my father with instructions to wait for the right time. That time never came for him or for me, but maybe it will come for you. The evidence is hidden behind the false wall in my workshop. The truth deserves to survive. Kate stared at the letter, her hands trembling as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about historical discovery anymore. This was about confronting one of Wyoming's most powerful families with evidence that could destroy everything they'd built their reputation on. Outside the railway car, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and Kate couldn't shake the feeling that the real storm was just beginning. I'm curious about your own experiences with truth and courage. Have you ever discovered something that forced you to choose between staying safe and doing what's right? Sometimes life puts us in positions where we have to decide who we really are. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your stories might inspire others facing similar crossroads. And if you're finding Kate's journey compelling, please hit that like button to help others discover this story of ordinary courage. The confrontation Kate had been dreading came sooner than expected. 3 days after she contacted the Wyoming Tribune with James's story, Robert Ashford III arrived at her railway car unannounced, accompanied by 2 lawyers and a private investigator who had been digging into every detail of Kate's life since her divorce. "Ms. Morrison," Robert said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from generations of wealth and power, "I understand you believe you found something significant, but I'm here to explain why you're mistaken." At 55, Robert Ashford had his ancestor William's height and bearing, but none of the compassion that had driven William to sacrifice everything for justice. He moved through Kate's small space like he owned it, examining James's workspace with the dismissive air of someone who had spent his life controlling narratives. "This is obviously a fabrication," he continued, picking up one of James's journals. "My family has extensive records of William's death in 1943. He was a troubled young man whose drinking led to reckless behavior. These documents are either forgeries or the fantasies of someone with mental health issues." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Kate's divorce records, her financial struggles, her recent medication for depression, they'd found it all and were prepared to use it to destroy her credibility. But Kate had learned something important during her months in the railway car. She'd learned the difference between being afraid and being defeated. "Mr. Ashford," she said calmly, "I think you should see what Harold Sullivan left for us." Kate knew that in this moment, everything would change. Win or lose, her quiet life in the railway car was over. But as she looked at Robert Ashford's confident face, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. This is one of those moments that define us, isn't it? When we have to choose between our safety and our principles. What gives you courage when you're facing something that feels impossible? I'd love to know your thoughts. Drop them below, and let's support each other through the challenges that test our resolve. The workshop behind Dorothy's house contained more than Kate had imagined. Harold's hidden cache included not just copies of the wartime documents his grandfather had saved, but decades of additional research. Harold had spent 20 years quietly investigating the Ashford family, documenting their continued use of political influence to bury inconvenient truths. The evidence was overwhelming. Photographs of the forced labor camps, payroll records showing payments to guards who had later died in accidents, and correspondence between the Ashford mining operations and government officials who had arranged for the camps to be erased from official records. Most damning of all was a recording Harold had made in 2018, his interview with Eleanor Whitman, who revealed that she wasn't just a retired librarian. She was the daughter of one of the Jewish refugees James and William had saved. Her family had been housed at the Ashford labor camp before their escape, and she'd spent 75 years waiting for someone brave enough to tell the truth. "My father made me promise never to speak about what happened," Ellie said on the recording, her voice shaking with age but strong with conviction. "But he also made me promise to tell the truth if someone ever came looking for it. James Whitaker and William Ashford saved my family's life. They saved hundreds of families, and the Ashfords have been lying about it ever since." When Kate played this recording for Robert Ashford and his lawyers, the change in their demeanor was immediate. The bluster and threats evaporated, replaced by the cold calculation of people who understood they were facing exposure that could destroy everything they'd built. "What do you want?" Robert asked finally. Kate thought about the question for a long moment, looking around the railway car that had become her sanctuary. What did she want? Justice for James and William? Recognition for the families they'd saved? Revenge against the powerful family that had buried their heroism? "I want the truth to be told," she said finally. "I want William's real story to be part of the historical record. I want the families James saved to know what happened to them. And I want the money William set aside for this purpose to be used the way he intended." The negotiation that followed lasted 3 days. Robert Ashford's lawyers tried every tactic they could think of: financial incentives for Kate's silence, threats of lengthy court battles, even attempts to have her declared mentally incompetent. But Harold's evidence was too comprehensive, and Kate's allies too numerous. Martha had rallied the Historical Society. Tom had contacted veterans organizations who understood the importance of preserving wartime heroes. Emma had used her marketing skills to build social media support for Kate's cause, and Eleanor Whitman, despite her advanced age, had agreed to go on record with her family's story. The breakthrough came when Dorothy revealed the final piece of Harold's investigation: bank records showing that William Ashford had indeed established a trust fund before his staged death, managed by a series of lawyers over the decades. The fund, now worth over $3 million, had been accumulating interest for 80 years, waiting for the moment when the truth could finally be told. The story broke in the Wyoming Tribune on a Tuesday morning in June, and within hours it had spread across social media platforms and been picked up by national news outlets. Sarah Chen, the Tribune's investigative reporter, had worked with Kate to craft a story that was both historically rigorous and deeply moving. Hidden Heroes: How Two Men Saved 200 Families and Changed Wyoming Forever detailed not just James and William's courage, but the systematic cover-up that had followed. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Descendants of families James and William had helped came forward with stories, photographs, and documents that had been hidden for generations. And historians from universities across the region reached out to study Kate's discoveries. The Holocaust Memorial Museum expressed interest in adding the railway car to their collection of preserved sites. But more importantly, the story sparked a broader conversation about hidden histories and the heroes who had fought injustice in ways that were never recorded in official documents. Robert Ashford withdrew from the gubernatorial race. The Family Foundation was restructured to focus on refugee assistance and historical preservation. And William's trust fund was finally used as he had intended, to establish educational programs, support refugee families, and ensure that the stories of hidden heroes were preserved for future generations. By autumn, the railway car had been designated as a state historical site. Kate found herself appointed as the director of the Whitaker Ashford Memorial Foundation, with a salary that allowed her to dedicate herself fully to preserving the stories that had been hidden for so long. Emma moved back from Denver, taking a position with the foundation and bringing Marcus, who turned out to have a passion for historical preservation that matched Kate's newfound calling. Their relationship, strained by years of Kate's overprotective hovering, deepened into the kind of partnership Kate had always hoped they might share. Tom Bradley became more than a helpful neighbor, their shared understanding of loss blooming into a love built on mutual respect and genuine companionship. They took their relationship slowly, both understanding that the best partnerships were built on solid foundations rather than desperate need. On a crisp November evening, as the first serious snow of the season began to fall, Kate stood in the railway car that had transformed her life. The hidden workspace was now open to visitors, displaying James's journals and William's photographs alongside Harold's research and Eleanor's testimony. Dorothy joined her, as she often did these days, two women who had found purpose in preserving stories that mattered. "Harold would have been so proud," Dorothy said, watching a group of high school students examine the exhibits with the kind of intense attention that suggested they understood they were seeing something important. Kate thought about the terrified woman who had stood in this same spot 11 months earlier, believing that her life was over at 52. That woman couldn't have imagined the life Kate lived now. Meaningful work that honored heroes from the past while creating hope for the future, deep friendships built on shared purpose, a daughter who had become her partner in preserving truth. The Whitaker Ashford Memorial Foundation had awarded its first scholarships that fall, $15,000 each to refugee students studying history, social work, and education. A memorial garden was being planned for Millbrook, featuring quotes from James's journals and stones representing each of the families they'd saved. Eleanor Whitman, despite her 90 years, had become the Foundation's most powerful advocate, speaking at schools and community centers about the importance of ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things when justice demanded it. Some secrets, Eleanor told audiences, are kept not to hide shame, but to preserve hope until the world is ready to hear it. The railway car remained where it had always been, leading nowhere and everywhere at once. Kate had learned that sometimes the most important journeys happened while standing perfectly still. Sometimes salvation looked like a weathered train car and a $500 leap of faith. Sometimes the stories we most need to tell are the ones that have been waiting patiently for us to be brave enough to hear them. Outside, snow fell steadily, transforming the landscape into something clean and new. Inside the railway car, surrounded by the evidence of courage that had echoed across 8 decades, Kate Morrison prepared for whatever chapter came next. She had learned that broken places could become the strongest foundations, and that the stories we preserve today become the inspiration for tomorrow's heroes. In choosing to tell James and William's story, Kate had found her own voice. In honoring their courage, she had discovered her own strength. And in a railway car that had once hidden desperate families seeking safety, a woman who had thought her life was ending at 52 had instead found the place where her real story could finally begin. The sanctuary had saved her, and now she would ensure it saved others, one story at a time. Thank you for joining me on Kate's remarkable journey from desperation to purpose. If this story has touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late to begin again. Subscribe for more stories of ordinary people finding extraordinary courage. And remember, sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives are written when we think the story's over.